Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. If you've been listening to the show for a while, then you know that I am passionate about agriculture and finding ways to more efficiently grow food for our growing population. Well, we crossed a huge milestone in that area this week as the global population hit the 8 billion mark. 8 billion is a huge number, and that's a lot of food that we need to farm to feed everybody. We thought this would be a great time to revisit one of our old episodes that is all about the future of agriculture with our guest, Devon Hankins, Dr. Joel Cuello. How are we going to feed 8 billion people? Well, our awesome guests have some ideas. Quick reminder to rate, review, and subscribe to our show wherever you're listening. You can also find the full videos of our show on the YouTube page. And if you learned something from Dr. Cuello, Devon, Otis, or I during our conversation, make sure to share this episode with someone else so they can learn it too. This episode is brought to you by Tribe and Purpose. The transition from college to that first career is a difficult one, and it's even harder when you lose your sense of identity. If you're an athlete who just hung up the cleats, it's really hard to go from being a rugby player to being Joe in accounting. We created Next is Best to help retired college athletes use their skills to create an impact through entrepreneurship. Next is Best by Know Your Tribe will help to smoothen that rough transition by helping you establish a clear sense of purpose, an actionable path to success, and the tools you need to manage your life. Your 20s are a confusing and chaotic time. Next is Best gives you the tools that you need to make sense of the chaos and make this next chapter of your life the best one yet. You can learn more about Next is Best by Know Your Tribe at findyourpurpose.coach. Now here's Cam and Otis with the show.
Hey, welcome to the Cam and Otis Show. Today we got, man, we're just breaking all kinds of new patterns here at Camden. We got double repeat guests coming on today. We have Dr. Joel Cuello from University of Arizona, episode 14. Man, it's hard to believe it's that long ago. Episode 14. Joel, thanks for being on the show with us today. And
thanks for having me.
Devon Hankins. Devon was just a few weeks ago, episode 38. And if you haven't checked that one out, you can jump back on that one too, because we talked about some great stuff on that show. But today we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about some agricultural business and what that's doing to our economy and how our economy in the current state is affecting the agricultural business. And I just think it's really an interesting subject to dive into and real-time effect, because you're seeing meat plants shutting down because guys are getting sick, farmers trashing things because there's no market for them because restaurants are closed and all this, that, and the other. And I just want to throw it to you, Camden, and get this conversation kicked out.
Yeah, so I think just start off right there with the really topical side of things, that we're looking at a situation where we're having all these sort of supply chain issues and issues inside the agricultural economy that are causing all these funky things to happen, whether it's, farmers, you see the videos of farmers pouring milk down the drain, prices going up in grocery stores, all of these type of different things. And so I think largely we can talk about a little bit of, as we're talking about the future of agriculture and diving in on that, what can we do as far as, farmers and people inside the industry to help to build in systems to combat this from happening again, or, changing the system so that these things don't happen in quite the same fashion. So Devon, I'll throw it over to you. So one of the pieces that I love when I get into agriculture, and I'm kind of a hybrid, I guess, because I studied agricultural business and economics like you, Devon, but then I also got my science expertise from a few classes with Dr. Cuello over there. So one of the things I look at is, as far as the creative solutions in this type of situation, one of the things that we talked about on your episode, Devon, is the importance of moving toward, or not necessarily moving towards, but the importance of local agriculture and having these family farm type models. And so one of the things I find very interesting in the current situation is that when you have this shortened supply chain of local agriculture, is that you have a much more responsive local agricultural economy. And then you're also able to, because it's more responsive, you can kind of cut out some of these supply chain issues. Is that something that you would agree with, or do you have another insight into there?
So I'm always about balance, right? Because we have different levels of needs. So we have an increasing population of and a need to supply that population. And I think that we need to come from a perspective of supplying food for the collective rather than this notion, this perspective of a supply chain that's just geared towards either I'm a domestic producer or I'm producing internationally and we're looking at exports and imports. We have to take a more collective view and realize that we've got to feed the world, right? We don't, it's just not, who's around the corner. Now, how we go about feeding the world, well, there's different channels to that, obviously, right? So if you're somewhere like in Louisville, we've been dealing a lot with the urban agriculture, right? We are a city, though we're surrounded by a lot of rural areas. So we have small farms and we have large farms. So we've balanced big farming. You've got Purdue Farms just, over in Indiana. So you've got big farming. And then you've got boutique and niche farming at the local level. They all serve their purpose, right, to feed those in need. And we're all in need. And I think that it's worthwhile to take time to focus on each one of those areas. I don't believe in that there's a panacea for just everything, right? There's the needs are unique. And so if you're in the urban, if you're in the urban area and we start talking about urban agriculture, that's a relevant discussion, right? But it's also a discussion where you can take the methodologies and I think the best practices that are used there, and you can apply it to big farming and vice versa. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm very hesitant to go with this one size fits all kind of thing. Because, here in a very short, circumference, if you go out 100 miles, we've got boutiques all the way to big farming, and they all fill a need. They overlap on the consumer that they serve. So I think, supply really needs to, and Dr. Cuello, you may argue for or against this, but, I don't think that this focus of supply side of the channel leading the discussion is always the way to go. We really need to look at demand. What is demand demanding, right? We have, really savvy consumers out there, right? On one side of the continuum. And then we have folks who just don't want to be hungry tomorrow, right? And so that's a vast continuum of need. And so there are different solutions in those spaces. So I don't know, did I answer your question? I told you I'd come in here with opinions. Okay, well, and it's going to be Dr. Cuello's, responsibility, right, to validate those opinions with some actual facts. So,
well, I think to send it over to you, Dr. Cuello, that this reminds me a lot of what we talked about in some of your classes, where it's really about making economic sense of the production means. That there's plenty of crops that you can grow, whether it's indoor farms, vertical, hybrid greenhouses, all these different types of things that are coming around nowadays. But it's about whether or not that makes economic sense. And so, Devon, to your point, the large corporate farms that are out there doing all this, the monocrop farming, it's because they're really efficient at it. And we can't replicate that in a greenhouse. That's just, it's not going to happen on the same type of scale. But I think that's where the innovation and the work that you're doing, Dr. Cuello, comes in.
Right. So I just want to make a general comment. Of course, I agree with what Devon just said, that it's important to consider both the supply side as well as the demand side to be able to create an economy that really is not only economically sustainable, but also environmentally sustainable and socially sustainable. And in the face of COVID-19 pandemic, it's really shown us the importance of the system being resilient as well. So what the current pandemic has really exposed is the inadequacy and the lack of resilience of the fresh food supply chain in the United States. Even though it's just a distribution system, of course, it impacts as well the producers, the production side, and of course the end users. So as it happens in the United States, we have a double-stranded supply chain for fresh produce. We have one supply chain that is geared toward the food service sector. So that would be those suppliers that are catering to hotels and restaurants and schools and institutions. And then another strand of the supply chain that's catering toward the retail end. So you have the consumers in the grocery stores, bodegas, and so on and so forth. So what happened now with the stay-at-home orders in various states in the United States is that it precipitated the closing of offices, of schools, of restaurants, even though there's still takeout, but there's been a dramatic decrease in the patronage of restaurants. And so the demand on the food service sector of the supply chain has dramatically dropped. And so all of a sudden, you've got these producers and suppliers that basically are caught with, lots of produce in their hands, and they have nowhere to supply them. And as it turns out, these two supply chains do not communicate with one another, or they do not basically help one another, essentially. And so the produce that is in the food service supply chain cannot easily be transferred into the retail supply chain because there are differences in terms of the labeling of the food, in terms of the volume of the food as well. Even the volume that they have, the packaging size that they have in the food service industry is too big to be sold to Costco, for instance. And so that is the main problem that we're encountering here as to why we see a lot of fresh produce being disposed. A lot of fresh produce on the farm, vegetables that are being plowed back into the ground because, again, it's too expensive. They have nowhere to go. The producers don't have anywhere to sell them. And so that has exposed essentially the flaw in the fresh produce supply chain in the face of this pandemic. And of course, so that's resilience. The other one is the sustainability issue as well. In other words, and Camden, you referred to this in terms of being local and regional. There really is a lot of benefits to that because, again, right now, a lot of fresh vegetables, particularly in the wintertime, are coming from California and mainly in Arizona to be transported to New York City, for instance. That's a lot of miles. And there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions involved in that. So it really makes sense to consider re-engineering the supply chain and the production to be not just local, well, maybe not too local, but even regional. Because that would really increase both the sustainability as well as the resilience of that supply chain. And by supply chain, I'm really referring to the entire system, meaning the producers, the distribution system, as well as the outlets.
That's really interesting. And it's one of those, it sounds like it's in order to fix the problem, you got to pull everybody into a room and say, you do this, and you do that, which is completely outside of anything that's even feasible to consider. But
isn't that what Devon does?
I'm on it. I'm on it, Cam. I'm on it. I'm on it.
And that's what I was getting to, because with where she was working and in the policy world and having that effect in a small community, that's where I'm curious. And I'll throw it at you, Devon, on the policy side first, but I want Joel to jump in and kind of tell us, on the science and backing economic side. But, if everything starts somewhere with a change, and if we develop a change in a community, then that community, if it's successful, what's the highest form of flattery? Imitation, right? So if I'm seeing it happen in Louisville and I'm in Colorado Springs, how do I make that happen in my town like it's happening there? So I want to toss that to you from a policy kind of perspective, Devon, and just kind of help us understand how we could do that.
So it is just as simple as bringing a couple of people into a room. Several years ago, when Kentucky was receiving its antitrust funding from the Big Tobacco antitrust award, Governor Patton at the time started an office called the Governor's Office of Ag Policy. and it was brand new under his administration. And our responsibility was to take the funds that came from the antitrust effort. Well, you know, what happened there with the claim and the funds that we would receive, and figure out how do we help tobacco farmers divest from the tobacco farming and enter into other diversified farming opportunities. Okay, so we were really good at producing tobacco, but we had to find production opportunities that would allow, you know, and it was very generational. So we had to figure out, how do you take the farming practices that they're used to implementing, the equipment that they had, and marry it to a production opportunity where the, you know, the cost of transitioning in wouldn't be too much for them to bear. I say all this to say is that we started looking at supply systems, supply channels, production systems, production channels, and who did we need to bring to the table to have the conversations to make a change like this. This was a huge step change. We're talking about something that was very historical for us as Kentucky, because we were tobacco farmers. That was our culture. And so you're changing a culture as well. Because of my experience having worked for Philip Morris, particularly on the food service side, I had understood that we really had to connect with processors as well, right, Dr. Cuello? Once you produce, you can be good at producing, but if you can't get that product to the farm table or the people who help service the, you know, the hotels and the restaurants, it's not going to happen. Right. And so we started having those conversations. It's like, not only did we have to shift production, but you go from growing tobacco to, let's say, blueberries, right? And so, okay, what are you going to do with those blueberries? Well, we got to find a processor. You know, how is that going to be jam? Is that going to be frozen, you know, fruit that goes into smoothies for a company that, you know, makes smoothies out there? Like, how do we solve that problem? And so it was really about bringing the production side and the supply side folks into a conversation and saying, how can we get the food from the farm to the table? This conversation is no different, okay? Correct. It's no different. So you've got big farmers who are throwing milk down the drain, right? You've got lettuce that's spoiling in you know, in these large areas, or they're still left in the ground. We just need to make, you know, everybody's, you know, we have to connect them, right? Because they're the supply, there is a demand, let's connect it. It's not that hard, it's not rocket science. Mm-hmm. Somebody's just got to have to start having conversations. Exactly. You know, if we have here in Kentucky, we have bourbon distilleries making products that they weren't used to making, hand sanitizer. If we can do that, right? Like, you can switch the system if you want to. It's just making sure that you have the people have the right conversations. You've got the right people at the table. You know, Dr. Cuello, I think, you know, when you talk about the companies that are used to working with food service purveyors, right? And the packaging is at such a bulk level that they can't even sell to the Costco's or the Sam's of the world, okay? Yeah. All right, perhaps, okay? But what's the disconnect? Let's figure out what the disconnect is. Exactly, right. And what, you can't put this stuff in smaller boxes? And I'm not being facetious, like it is that simple, but it's somebody coming to the other person and saying, knock, hey guys, we've got people to feed, you've got food, let's make this happen. I mean, the pandemic has required not only the ag industry, but many industries to have to reconfigure the way they provide their service and deliver their products. Where the food situation is no different.
Right. And Yvonne, you're right. It's not rocket science. And as you pointed out as well, why can't the suppliers for this food service industry just repackage, their bulk uh, produce into quantities that can easily be sold in grocery stores, for instance. Of course, they can do that. The only thing is that they were really caught by surprise with this pandemic and with the shutting down of most of the outlets in the food service industry. And of course, for them to be able to, because we're talking large quantities here of fresh produce, it's not that easy for them to quickly basically repackage their produce and relabel them, and also to establish quick contracts with the retail stores. That's their problem. And meanwhile, they have fresh produce that has a very short, shelf storage. And so instead of them really going bad, then they just give them up. So anyway, but I really completely agree with you that this is an opportunity, really. This pandemic is an opportunity for a whole industry approach in terms of having a conversation, having negotiations so that a more resilient and sustainable food supply chain, including the producers and the outlets, can be produced in the United States and, of course, worldwide as well. And there is, of course, a big economic incentive that is going to drive this conversation. Because, for instance, the food service part of this industry is worth about $300 billion a year. And there's about 15,000 suppliers that are involved just in the food service part of the industry. And of course, right now, everything is devastated for them. And so it's in their interest really to be part of this conversation and to negotiate and formulate and create a system that is more resilient so that they will be spared in the future from having this historic loss. And, as experts are saying, this is a new normal for us. And COVID-19, hopefully it will go away very soon, but there's a possibility that it may not entirely go away. And there might be some new virus strains going forward that we may encounter. And so, we really have to be prepared as an industry to be as resilient as possible.
I think one thing that we see with this, and it's kind of getting like the historical perspective when you look at the growth of the agricultural economy inside America, is that, free market is very efficient, but it's based on the incentives that you're seeing at that time. One of my favorite little fun facts is going back to how grocery stores and a lot of the monocrop farming goes back to a lot of government programs during the Cold War, because we had to feed the country. We had to feed the countries around us, because that was one of the ways that we could beat Russia, the USSR, was by having this supremely efficient agricultural economy. And it worked very, very well. But the problem is that you start to have incentives changing over time. But you still have that sort of economic inertia that kind of holds things back. But one of the other interesting, pieces of historical perspective is the economic impact that pandemics can have and other huge crises can have to jar people forward and kind of get rid of that inertia that people are feeling. And I think that's really what y'all are both hitting on right now, is that we have this opportunity to reshape. And that's not saying that we need to completely redo every little aspect of it, but just realign the incentives, my favorite buzzword, realign the incentives so that we're all working on the same page, and that we can, because that's what's happening here. People want to pay for their food. That money will go through the system. We can align those incentives, but it's about getting people to the table and having those proper conversations and really getting there and moving forward so we can all be on the same page with things.
And I think there are truly, like Dr. Cuello has pointed out, yes, there are some challenges. But one thing I know as a policy analyst and having worked in government and on programs, there are always opportunities and solutions that will keep you within the guidelines, but allows flexibility. And people who have put these systems and programs together understand where those spaces are. And that's where you have to begin to connect, right? To your point, by no means am I saying that, we can disregard compliance standards or, supply and production standards, right? Be they legal impact or just the way that, the most efficient way of doing things. But there are opportunities to be flexible in those spaces. So it's a matter of, having the right people who understand the programs, the incentives, the systems, and figuring out where are those touch points and starting there, and it's not going to be this big grand thing initially, right? But the point is to find the interconnectedness and work on that and move out. And in the meantime, the big structural policy pieces that have to be changed in order to open that channel up wider can begin to happen simultaneously. But I don't know that we need to have huge structural policy changes before we can begin to connect the dots and get something going, to get something happening. I'm not convinced that there's no way for us to address conventional packaging just because you're used to providing, products to the food service sector. Like, you can't get me to believe that there's not an organization out there that's not willing to come to the table and figure that out. Because at the end of the day, they need to sell food, right?
Right. It's almost,
what do we need to do to get this into a small enough pack? And I know we're simplifying it, but what do we need to do to get this into a small enough package to maybe our eye isn't on getting it into Kroger's, maybe it's our eye in getting it to Costco or Sam's, because that's about as small as we can drop that down into, right? And so that is a space for delivery. I think you right size it, right? If that makes sense.
I think to your point that it's kind of one of those things where when you have all these different businesses that are struggling with it, for example, the distilleries that are switching over to making hand sanitizer, there's someone out, and it's one of those, like, if you had the big map that could tell you everyone's problems, you can figure it out. But there's got to be a company out there that's making plastic boxes that are shipping other things that aren't being shipped anymore. And it's about just kind of connecting those different dots into those systems. One great example I think I've seen recently is Arizona. I'm blanking on the name of the governing body, but I know that the beef farmers in Arizona are setting up a system to sell directly to consumers and to circumvent some of that, because the ranchers, they have the meat. It's there, but there's a disconnect. And so by connecting directly to them, you're able to circumvent some pieces of that.
Right.
Right.
I wanted to say something, and I think this is tossing something to you, probably a softball for you, Joel. That innovation has to drive policy and not the other way around. So you've worked in some really kind of interesting agricultural innovative ways and areas, some of those studies that you've done with NASA and other places that I can't remember. But I'm just curious. So what's the innovation that this COVID catalyst has got us moving towards for agriculture?
Right. Yes, yeah. And you're right. Policies should be driven by innovation, in addition, of course, to the practical need. Before I answer your question, I just want to kind of summarize what we've been discussing here. I wrote an article, actually, and I apologize for not being able to share this with you before the show. But I kind of wrote an article and addressed this issue of the massive disruption in the supply chain in the U.S. And I came up with 5 guidelines or principles that should be considered in re-engineering America's double-stranded fresh produce supply chain. One is, I already referred to this, is regionally and locally based as much as possible. Of course, that's not going to happen strictly. I mean, there are states that in the winter time, they're just not able to produce vegetables, for instance. And so they have to depend on the other states. And interstate commerce, of course, is not bad at all. It should be encouraged as well. But there has to be that aspiration of being able to build a regional or local system for food production in various regions of the United States. Second is inclusion of small and medium scale producers. because right now the supply chain, the food supply chain in the United States is pretty much dominated by the super farms or the large companies. And it would be good to include in that mix some small and medium scale producers, because that would increase their flexibility and the rate by which they could react to disruptions such as a pandemic. Third is mixing of food service and retail clients in the chains. And Devon and I have really basically talked about this, that in the time of a pandemic, for instance, there's closures of lots of restaurants, the suppliers in the food service should be allowed or should be able to more conveniently channel their food supply into the retail supply chain as well. Inclusion of indoor and or vertical farming production. And this is basically a part of the answer to your question, and I'll get back to that. The fifth one is linking producer farms with sources of renewable energy. This is also kind of related to that, so that the production can become more environmentally sustainable, not only in terms of energy, but also in terms of water and land use as well. And the last recommendation I have is certification of the supply chain nexus. There should be an independent body that could adjudicate and award to this supply chain nexus that it can be verified to be sustainable and resilient. I'll give you a copy of this. Anyway, but you're right, innovation. So one of the innovative approaches that we've been developing here at the University of Arizona is vertical farming, or a closed indoor farming. And it's not meant to be a panacea. It's not meant to altogether replace traditional farming, but it should be incorporated into the mix of production of food, so that we can make the entire production system more sustainable and resilient. So vertical farming, I think I talked about this last time, is basically a warehouse type of production of food, where you're producing food inside a warehouse in shelves that are stacked one on top of another. You may use some sunlight, but typically we use light-emitting diodes as a source of light. We're using hydroponics or aeroponics, so this is a soil-less system, so it's cleaner, less subject to infection from microorganisms. We regulate the temperature, relative humidity, and other environmental factors as well. And so, in other words, we're able then to optimize the growth rate and the productivity and the yield of the crops. And the quality as well is maximized. And this is an operation that is completely divorced from or independent of the geography, the weather, the climate. And so you can do production 24/7, 365 days a year. It doesn't matter whether you're in the South Pole or the North Pole, or in the Midwest, or here in the Southwest. It really is not going to be a factor. But of course, there's the matter of energy, because you save on land. You save 80% to 90% of water compared with traditional open field cultivation, but you pay for it all in terms of energy. But again, one of the recommendations is to use renewable energy. There's sunlight, there's wind, there's geothermal, and there's even energy that you can produce from waste. We have a lot of cities, big cities here in the United States, and every city has a number of wastewater treatment plants. And those wastewater treatment plants can be designed as well to include some of the organic wastes or the food scraps that are generated by the residents of the city. And through that treatment, it's an anaerobic process, you can actually produce renewable natural gas, which can be readily used for residential purposes, as well, of course, for food production in vertical farms.
This episode is brought to you by Tribe and Purpose. If you're a college athlete who just hung up the cleats and you're looking to make an impact as an entrepreneur, then Next is Best by Know Your Tribe is perfect for you. Get a clear sense of purpose and a path to success so that you can make a bigger impact and make this next chapter of your life the best one yet. Learn more today at findyourpurpose.coach. Now let's get back to the show.
So one piece that I'd like to kind of get into a discussion of, and kind of goes more into your ballpark, Devon, is that something that this is, as I was going through my schooling in agricultural economics and these type of things, that when you see these areas where the incentives aren't lining up and these type of things, it can get, I mean, honestly, kind of frustrating when you look at them about how do you change that kind of system. And they all come, like we were saying earlier, they all come from good places. There's a reason that we have these huge monocrop farms. It's because they're very efficient and they can feed a lot of people, which, like you said, Devon, that's obviously the first priority there. But then I think when you look at it in the big scale of things, and you have these issues like the resilience or the responsiveness to crisis and these type of things, that then it's like, okay, well then how do you kind of balance that from a policy perspective? Is it something where are we at a point where we can even start moving away from, and not eliminating these farms entirely, of course, but moving away from the type of huge scale farming that has this to me, a kind of a perverse incentive based from the policy side of where you're growing the max amount of crops for the set rate, and it's just about a guarantee that you're able to get that rate because we need that production. And that all comes, again, it comes from a great place, but then you kind of get this lag to where, if the way I see it, if you have some piece of that that's going towards whether it's, incentivizing more innovation or, subsidizing in those different areas, that you can kind of help to jar a little bit more of this shift that we're talking about towards the more sustainable sides of things without completely interrupting that side of the industry. Does that make sense at all, Devon? Do you have anything on that?
Okay, so I'm trying to track you. So big farming,
Mm-hmm.
right? It has its place. Some people think of it as a necessary evil. It's not. Okay. People have to understand that feeding people and feeding the world it's not always financially secure effort. It is an industry that is not really appreciated as much as it should be, because at the end of the day, you are feeding people and you're providing a lot of the medicinal input, right, for health on the other end of the spectrum. I think people have to understand the why of things. Right? So why did we set the system up this way? Okay. And do those whys, are those still relevant? And if they are, then who has to take ownership for that? And where do we start making the change there? Right? I think that there are many programs that we have that are still on the books, whether it be in agriculture, to education, to financing, to anything else, that need to be revisited, right? But then that starts that scary word, reformation, right? It's like, and reformation is the cousin to change, right? And now you want to change structures, and oh my, and then let's not, forget that we're talking about, farming is a historical, ancestral culture, not only for the U.S., because we started out as an agrarian culture, right? But the farmers, oftentimes, whether it's a small niche farm or big farming, these are legacy entities. They're no different from any other legacy entity, right? And they're foundational. And I think that when you don't take all of that into, it's not a matter of, it is and it isn't. What's the environmental impact on the soil for big farming? What's the financial impact when you talk about futures? And how and what's the impact financially when you're talking about how they're funded, right? The incentives that you're talking about. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but at the end of the day, is it so bad for farmers to want to be profitable? Should they not truly be able to be profitable? And is the system set up for them to be profitable? Well, I would argue maybe not, if we've got to have incentives, right? Why do you have to set up an incentive? What the futures trading, like, why do you have to promise a farmer a certain rate?
Mm-hmm.
But yet you use the term free market, right? Like, there's a disconnect there, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that you're not going to get me to bash big farming any more than I bash, urban farming and boutique farming. Mm-hmm. They all serve a purpose. If the systems for which they were set up for are no longer serving the purpose that they were intended, then we all have a collective responsibility to go back to the drawing board, right? And figure out, well, let's pivot. But let's not be naive, Cam, right? The way the system is set up benefits people mm-hmm. that we know nothing about, right? And so we have to be mindful of that too, because don't think for 1 minute that big farming is not connected to geopolitics, okay? Any less so that niche farming isn't connected to geopolitics, right? And so there's the quote unquote dark side, right, to an honorable endeavor. And so you have to marry that from a policy. You can't do policy and not have politics. And anybody who says that they can, come see me, because I want to understand how they think those two are not married. But so you've got to always understand the political impact of that, right? And so in my mind, and this will probably get me in all kind of trouble, the politics of things is usually the first place where you start to see inefficiency of systems, mm-hmm. And it's because it's, even though it's always supposed to be for the greater good of the whole, how you go about getting to the greater good of the whole is not always pretty, mm-hmm. right? And so I think that maybe comes back to around for people who see big farming as the dark side of farming. No, I think they're getting a bad rap. They're serving a lot of purposes, some more obvious than others, okay? Do you really want to take down big farming in the U.S.? I don't think so. That's like dismantling your military. And there I go again. So there's another box. I'm probably in all sorts of trouble at this point. But I mean, that's how I see that, right? Is to begin to have these naive conversations about dismantling big farming in the U.S. You might as well have the same conversation about dismantling our military structure in the U.S., right? I mean, right? So yes. Probably, I lost a whole lot of friends there, but there I said it. So anyway, no, Dr. Cuello?
If I may, so there certainly is a place for big farming in the United States. And let's not diminish here the accomplishments of big farming in the United States. It's actually the big farms that enabled the United States to become the biggest food producer in the world. And that is a huge accomplishment. And it's really made the United States really a food secure nation in the world. Perhaps it's the most food secure nation in the world. And because of the efficiency of the big farms, they actually helped stabilize the price of food, not just in the United States, but even worldwide, globally. And so the contributions of big farms in the United States really has been tremendous. So what I'm advocating for, however, is a balance, with the big farms, but we don't want the big farms to eat up all of the other farms in America. There's a place for big farms, but there should be a place as well for the medium and the small farms, as well as the new controlled environment or urban farming. So there's a place for everybody. Again, we cannot diminish the impact and the significance and the importance of the big farms. There's a place for them. And so Devon, in terms of the policy, she started with the whys. And that is always very important because that's the reason as to why the super farms really flourish in America is because of the why. And their why is efficiency. There is a need for efficiency in terms of food production, to be able to produce so much food and meet the food demand of America and the world, but at the same time do it in a very efficient way, cost-wise, and economically efficient way. But there's a price tag there, and that is the sustainability. And that is a major concern. And this is still not in the radar of a lot of scientists and a lot of farmers, is that the sustainability of the food bowl in the United States really is questionable. And I'm talking about water. So the food basket of the US is centered in the Midwest, and the Midwestern farms, the big farms, are relying on fossil water, which is in the Ogallala aquifer. It's actually ancient water. It's water that's been stored in the Ogallala aquifer for millennia, for centuries. And basically the farms in the Midwest are pumping out this water. And the rate of recharge of this water is vanishingly small. So in other words, the water that's being used by a lot of super farms in the Midwest is non-renewable water. And that is a big concern. When is it going to run out? Some experts have made the estimates, perhaps at the end of the century or a little after the end of the century. But that's still far away. That's not going to happen in our lifetime. But we have to think of future generations, of course. So this should come in as variables, as factors. They should come into the conversation about setting policy. Again, the goal is not to eliminate the big farms because, again, they're very efficient. But again, to come up with the right mix of sizes of farms and types of farms to make food production in the United States and the rest of the world as well efficient, but at the same time environmentally sustainable and resilient, that could withstand disruptions such as by pandemics as we see them today. So the irony here, by the way, I just want to point this out, is there's no food shortage in the United States. The United States has a lot of food, and as shown by those the milk and the vegetables that are being disposed, there is abundance of food in the United States. The current problem right now is in the distribution and the supply chain. So that needs correction and re-engineering as well.
And I think, Cam, if I could have things my way, when you think from a policy perspective, it is having conversations and setting up language structure, right? Because that's what policy is, such that, big farming, mid-sized farms, small farms, boutique farms, urban farming, traditional farming, for us not to see those as separate things, right? That it is an integrated system. And so rather than big farming being the big bad guy, big farming serves a purpose, as does boutique farming. And if we can start to have the conversation from there, that they all hold value in this space, because at the end of the day, we have to feed the world. We have to feed the collective, okay? What is your role in feeding that collective? How can we help you do it effectively without harming Mother Earth, right? Because that's the bid, is to get the job done without hurting Mother Earth, and do it in a way that is also beneficial to you, right, from an economic financial standpoint. If we see it as a collective effort rather than pitting against each other, I think we have a better chance of solving the world problem, right? Because if there's nothing else that this pandemic has showed us, we are our brother's keeper. What we do does impact other people, right? And it happens pretty quickly. So, this fallacy that, what I do on this part of the hemisphere has no impact on the other side of the hemisphere. I think we've blown all that out of the water, right? And so the conversation, the perspective of the conversation, be it policy, politics, how we apply technology, how we do research, whatever the case may be, it must come from the perspective of the collective, right? And I think when you do that, I have found in my career, in my practice, is that you get better results, you get more effective results, and you get the results quicker, right? Because when people understand the answer, Dr. Cuello, to the why, and they are in agreement, and they understand that they get to come to the solution, but from their avenue approach, man, you've got everything covered. I think, Otis, when you think about military exercises, right, and how we handle deploying against a mission, like you bring everything to bear, right? You don't forget a group of, you don't forget the infantry and just bring the chem folks. You got to bring everybody into the effort in order to get the job done. And so we have to have, the conversation has to be a collective conversation, because this is a collective issue, okay? And I think that would be my, like, how do you handle the policy thing? It's got to be from the collective perspective.
And my quick tidbit on that before you jump in, Dr. Cuello, is just as you're going through and talking about all these different players inside of it, one of the things that came to mind for me is that also one of the, I guess you could call it inefficiencies that we get a lot of the time, is that labels aren't very good. There's a lot of different labels out there and they're very blurry. And I can think of all sorts of different examples of, and not to pull out any specific policy and try to trash it or anything like that, but of trying to help one group of folks, and then a different group of folks are able to get into that because the label didn't quite work out right. I mean, well, easy example, the LA Lakers getting small business fund, like little things like that where it just doesn't quite line up. But that's why you have to be able to look at it in the grand picture of things, not just say, I'm going to help family farms. It's like, well, because my family farm works for Tyson. Like you can have all sorts of different issues inside of that. Those lines get really blurry.
Right.
Yeah. I just want to interject here another innovation because Otis asked me about innovation. So one is urban farming, vertical farming, controlled environment agriculture. The other one that's really in the pipeline right now is what's known as cultured meat or lab-grown meat or cell-based meat, or I think the preferred term right now is clean meat. So this is the tissue cultured meat that's produced in the lab. So this is really actually made of authentic and genuine animal cells. These are beef cells. These are nothing synthetic. So there are two steps in the process. One is to mass produce the cells in the lab in a culture broth. And then the next step is to organize the cells so that they would assume the structure of an actual meat tissue in terms of the morphology, in terms of the composition, the layer of fat, the layer of muscle fibers, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, there's the taste, and there's the level of juiciness, and the right texture, and so on and so forth. So this is under a tremendous investigation right now, and there's a lot of investments that's being poured into this, because the benefit of this is going to be much more sustainable. Because right now, livestock production is responsible for about 17 to 18% of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And also they're responsible for, I think, up to 80% of the deforestation in the Amazon. So it's not a clean process and it's not a sustainable process right now, but everybody loves to eat meat. Well, not everybody, but
I do.
A big percentage of the global population. And so these entrepreneurs and these innovators are trying to find a more sustainable way of producing meat. But there are hurdles currently. One is that the culture broth that they have to use to be able to grow the cells and to essentially assemble the tissue uses serum, animal serum. And that is very expensive. I checked and I think it's about $400 for 500 milliliters. And that is why the first lab-grown burger that was produced, I think this was back in 2015. Do you know how much it cost? It cost about $330,000. But that's 5 years ago. So now they've been able to significantly lower down the price. It's still high, but it's coming down. And they're doing this not just for beef cells, but also for chicken and fish cells as well. And so one one strategy that they've adapted in terms of kind of circumventing the high price of animal serum is to look at combinations of various plant-derived nutrients to be able to mimic the formulation of the animal serum that they then can use to grow these cells. So I think that this is a very promising innovation. And of course, there's already a backlash in the livestock industry because they would like to make a differentiation between this product. I think that in certain states, there's been some legislation that's been proposed that they should not call this lab-grown meat as meat. But anyway, I'm sure that that will be settled later on. In general, because of the promise of sustainability, I support this innovation. Mm-hmm. And again, the goal there is not to replace, of course, the beef industry or the livestock industry, but it's just, again, to add another mix into it so that we're not putting our eggs in one basket, so to speak, but we have a greater mix and diversity of food that is available toward greater sustainability and resilience.
Well, I'm thinking you give me a call when you get that Wagyu beef figured out, and
yes.
we get it down to, reasonable price, not Wagyu beef price, but, good reasonable
right
price.
Now,
Grow some lab-grown elk backstraps.
I think right now their level of accomplishment is in the stage of sloppy joes and chicken nuggets. Not yet in terms of Angus beef and all of those beef cuts.
All right. Well, hey, I want to thank y'all both for joining us today. And I'm going to kick us off with what I learned. And as always, my list is rather long. But I tell you what, the one that Joel threw out there kind of as that nugget of knowledge towards the end about the ancient waters, what's going on in the Midwest. Here I am, Mr. Naive. I'm thinking, hey, it rains. No, it doesn't work that way. But yeah, the fact that is, they're pumping the water out of the ground, and it's just like oil. There's only so much down there, and it takes a long time to get that stuff. So yeah, that's what I learned. Devon, how about you? What'd you learn?
Wow. I think I'm really impressed with Joel's work and the things that he's been working on. I love the innovation pieces, something as simple as the meat that they're working on. We've kind of laughed tongue in cheek about, they're at the sloppy Joe stage, but I think it's back to that point of, there is not just one solution to the problem of feeding the collective. And we have to be open-minded about something as, seemingly off the wall, right? As developing food in a lab or growing food in closed areas, right? And so I don't know if that's anything that I've learned, but I'm happy to know that we've got advocates in the space that are continually thinking about, what's the next possible solution to this ongoing issue that will never end. How do we feed the collective? Joel, how about you?
Well, I appreciate, of course, our discussion here, but Devon, I really appreciated the mind frame that you emphasize in terms of policy making. Is that basically it's all hands on deck approach. It's all of the stakeholders coming together and having this ongoing discussion and negotiation to come up with a policy that works for everybody. I think that's important. That's our goal, is to come up with a policy that will meet the needs for efficiency, productivity, sustainability, and resilience, but at the same time works for all of the stakeholders. Agreed.
Camden.
I learned that when I'm trying to do my multivariate problem solving, I need to make sure I give big farms a little bit more credit on that. I think and that's something I love my multivariate problem solving. I love thinking about these crazy complex problems. But I think, Devon, you checked me pretty good on that. I need to make sure I'm giving them a lot more credit than I think I do when I'm trying to think of some problem solving over here.
Because I mean, everything, they're all, the whole continuum is a piece to the puzzle. I'll tell you, Cam, and I'm sure Dr. Cuello can talk to you about this as a researcher, and getting buy-in. And he used the word stakeholders. Particularly my work at the city, working with Mayor Fisher. When there's a social problem that has to be solved, you have to bring all the stakeholders together, even the ones that disagree with you, even the ones that you don't feel have your same best interest at heart. They need to have a voice at that table, because their answer to the why has an impact on how this whole thing is going to work and if it's going to work. And so, you've got to have buy-in of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the good and the bad, the ugly is only defined by your perspective, right? Because the same good is somebody else's ugly. So that's why it's really important to bring all stakeholders to the table and have the conversation. I think, and I can't speak for Dr. Cuello, but as a researcher and an academician, he will benefit more so from policies, right, that have brought all stakeholders to the table.
Right.
And those that have failed to do so. And I think that if you put him in a corner and had him list the policies that he knows not all stakeholders were at the table, because he can feel, the pinch of it, that's what happens, right? Is when policy is, poor policy is more than likely policy where not all the right stakeholders and not all the relevant stakeholders were brought to the table.
Right. And I completely agree with that, Devon, because, as engineers, as scientists, we're about designing and formulating solutions, but these solutions do not and should not exist in a vacuum. It's always within the context of society with all of the stakeholders. And so the more we're informed about this, the stakeholders' views, the more then we're able to formulate our solutions in a way that it's completely relevant to the society.
Right. Absolutely. Well
and
said.
I think it's really something to kind of try to wrap it up here a little bit when we talk about these, multivariate problem solving and all this stuff. We piece all these different things that are coming together. It's really all just one big piece that's going to help further us along in that way. Of we talk marginal changes. Well, when you have marginal changes in each one of these areas, when you have lab grown meat take a little bit and they're more efficient and they take a little bit of the market, and then there's great innovation from Dr. Cuello here at U of A that helps monocropping get a little bit more efficient. And then you have the controlled environment that's bringing in another piece of it. Those all can kind of have those little marginal effects. And that's the real change that we're looking at here as far as having lasting change that's efficient and effective for everybody.
That's what step change looks like at the collective level, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Great stuff. Well, I got two things that popped into my mind. First is a disclaimer that the thoughts and opinions of Devon about dismantling the military and Big Farm are only of Devon and do not come from the Cam and Otis show. Got to say that out there.
Thank you, Otis. It's all good.
And then the other one, because me and stoicism, we didn't talk about rugby, so I got to throw out a stoic quote, because all I was thinking about the whole time we're talking about food is a quote from Socrates that is, "Thou shouldest eat to live, not live to eat." And that one just kept coming to mind. And with that, Camden, run us out, please.
All right. Thank you all again for listening to today's show. Special thanks to our guest, Dr. Joel Cuello and Devon Hankins, and our sponsors, MASH, Military and Athletic Strength Hemp Oil. You can check out recent episodes of the Cam and Otis Show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And check out a full archive at thecamandotishow.buzzsprout.com. And you can check out the Cam and Otis Show on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks again, and we'll see y'all next week.